Thank you very much, Jonathan. So this event is held in the memory of Dr. Reuben Paz, who passed away in February of this year. Born in 1950 in Haifa, Reuben served in the IDF. In 1971, he joined the Israeli security agency, the Shabak, or Shin Bet. He helped establish at the Shin Bet the research division, which he eventually headed until his retirement from the services 23 years later. Reuben did not fit most people's image of an intelligence analyst. He was soft-spoken. He had teddy bear-like features, for those of you who knew him, and he was way too nice for somebody in government. He was also extraordinarily humble. Early on in his life, he developed an insatiable passion for studying Islamic movements and history and the history of the Middle East, and he earned a BA, an MA, and later on, after his service in the Shabak, also a PhD in Middle Eastern history, all at the University of Haifa. After the tragic attacks of September 11th, 2001, there were many pundits who became overnight experts of terrorism, militant Islamism. Not so Reuben, who had devoted 3 decades of his life before 9/11 to develop an expertise on militant Islamism that was really unmatched in terms of depth and range. Along, of course, with a fluency in written and spoken Arabic. And he often used to say, actually, that he knew far more about Islam than about his own religion, Judaism. In 1997, Reuben joined the ICT, and for the next 3 years, he served as the Institute's first academic director. He continued to contribute to the mission of ICT in a variety of capacities, and I actually remember just a few weeks before he passed away, he took part in a session we had on ISIS. And during the session, there was one person who spoke, who made some, how to put it, some not so thoughtful remarks about Islam, and Reuben immediately interjected. He protested because he was a nice guy, but he had very low tolerance for BS. So after the 9/11 attacks, his insights were very much in high demand and sought by government security services and courts. He testified in over 19 cases. And they relied on him, we all relied on him, because he was not just an expert, but he was the expert's expert, really. 1 year after 9/11, Reuben founded within the IDC the Project for the Research of Islamist Movements, PRISM, which became of immense value to the academic and also the practitioner community of counterterrorism. He was one of the first people to argue. He published his writings on this website, which actually were noteworthy not only for their insights, but also because they adhered to the highest standards of academic and intellectual honesty and rigor. He was one of the first scholars. He was also prescient in his writings. He was one of the first scholars who spoke about Al-Qaeda after 9/11 turning into a global jihad movement. He also was one of the first people in the field to create a clearinghouse in which he published jihadi primary sources on his website. And so for these reasons and other reasons, he was oftentimes referred to as a pioneer of the modern study of jihad. And you don't have to take my words for it. You just have to look at the various postings on the social media that were shared about Reuben in the wake of his death. Reuben was beloved because he coupled deep expertise and passion with an equally deep sense of service, generosity, and willingness to help. He enjoyed sipping coffee, smoking way too many cigarettes also, with other scholars. He seemed to particularly enjoy shaping the minds of young scholars in whom he would imbue a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of Islam. And this may be one of his most important legacies, which is really his mentorship, especially of younger scholars whom he inspired deeply and whom he taught that Islam is not black and white, but it has many shades, it's full of dimensions, and yes, even beauty. Reuben the person, alas, was very much as multidimensional as the topic to which he devoted his life. Most people will remember him for his scholarly contributions, but besides Reuben Paz, the kind, humble, and brilliant scholar. He was also a loving father to his children in Balental. He also kept in very close touch with his first wife, Daniela, even after they divorced and they raised the children. He was Reuben, the art lover. He was a poet. He was Lek, the lover of ice cream, as he was referred to by his partner for the last 15 years, Linda, who's with us today. And so we miss him dearly. He died on February 22nd, 2015, at the age of 64. But in our hearts and minds, he lives on forever. May his memory be blessed. All right. So I have to make an rather uncomfortable transition now. But it's not really a transition because Reuben Paz would have certainly been with us today if he were still alive, because this topic was really meant for him, and he could have told us more about ISIS than all of us together. No offense to my esteemed colleagues. Before I will introduce the speakers of this panel, I'm just going to I was supposed to actually be one of the panelists. Unfortunately, Dan Williams, who was supposed to moderate the panel, he was held up in traffic from Jerusalem. And so let me just make a few remarks. I'm going to, I was planning on about 7 minutes of remarks for if I would have been a panelist. So I'm going to shorten them to about 2 minutes before, just to kind of set the stage. So the 2 points I wanted to make as a speaker in the panel were, first of all, that, and they relate in many ways to Martha, to Professor Crenshaw's remarks. By the way, it's really a huge honor to speak after Professor Crenshaw, who is really who did more for the academic field of terrorism studies than anybody I can think of. So connected to some of the points that you raised, one of the points I wanted to also, I would have elaborated in my formal remarks, is that we should not discount Al-Qaeda, right? The Islamic State appears to be on everybody's minds right now, but we should not forget that Al-Qaeda, people have declared Al-Qaeda dead for, at various times over the last 20 years. But Al-Qaeda, I think, is a force to be reckoned with. It's very sophisticated. It works in ways that differ from the ways of ISIS, in ways that can ensure its long-term survival. Another point I was going to mention, but I will actually throw it out later on to the panelists in the form of a question, is how should we actually think about this problem set? Is it terrorism? Of course it's terrorism, right? But is it something more than that? And if so, what is it? How should we call it? And does it matter? So with those brief introductory remarks, let me start by introducing, I'll introduce the speakers in the order in which they will speak, and I took the prerogative of the moderator to change the sequence of the speakers. The first person I'm going to introduce is Dr. Magnus Ranstorp. Is he here? Oh, here you are. Hi, Magnus. Dr. Magnus Ranstorp is a research director at the Center for Asymmetric Threat Studies at the Swedish Defense University. He was one of the first people who mapped out Hezbollah's activities in the early 1990s, and he actually, I believe he has met most of Hezbollah leaders over the years, which is worth a conversation with him in and of itself. He's one of the leading thinkers and scholars on the problem of radicalization and foreign fighters, and we're very, very happy to welcome him back to the ICT. The second speaker is going to be Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and an adjunct assistant professor in Georgetown University's Security Studies program. He's written many, many books. He's the author or volume editor of 12 books and monographs, including Bin Laden's Legacy. I believe he's working on a new book right now. We haven't had a chance to speak about the topic. We'll do it at some point. And he got his PhD just, I believe, 2 years ago or so from the Catholic University of America. The third speaker is going to be Aymenn Jawad al-Tamimi, who is a Rubin Fellow at the Rubin Center for Research and International Affairs at the IDC. Aymenn is an up-and-coming young scholar who has a very, very unique perspective into the Islamic State, perhaps really one of the most knowledgeable people on the Islamic State, who you should all check out his website, which contains primary source documents, especially on ISIS bureaucracy. His research covers all sides of the civil wars in Iraq and Syria, particularly focusing on the Islamic State, but also other jihadi groups. And last but not least, my colleague at my former employer, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Aaron Zelin, the Richard Borow Fellow at the Washington Institute, and the Rena and Sammy David Fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. He's also a PhD candidate at King's College London. He's one of the guys who everybody just assumes he's a doctor because he's so smart and he's all over the place, but he's going to be there soon. His dissertation is going to focus on the history of the Tunisian jihadi movement, and he's also the founder of jihadology.net, which is a clearinghouse for Sunni jihadi primary source material, and more recently also some influential Shiite militancy related documents. So welcome. This is a very, very distinguished panel. I'm going to ask the panelists to keep their remarks relatively short, if you can, about 7 to maximum 10 minutes, so we can have a discussion. So Magnus, please.
Shalom. Hello. It's great to be here. I want to thank ICT, everyone on the team, Boaz. It's a lot of people that make this a great event, which really unites practitioners and academics. I also want to pay tribute to the late Reuben Paz, who I met first in the 1990s, a great analyst, a pioneer, I would say, and your description of him, Assaf, was on the mark. And if you please go and read his Prism, his publications that is on the web, you can see that he was forecasting a lot of what we're seeing unfolding today. And you also mentioned kindly in your introduction that I've done some work on Hezbollah. And yesterday I wanted to jump in, but there's such many masters in the audience here. But it made me thought about one thing about conceptualizing all of these things, and I will bring maybe more a helicopter perspective of what I'm seeing from where I'm sitting. And I was reminded by something that Sir Mark Allen once told me. He said, understanding the Middle East is like playing three-dimensional chess underwater with all the pieces moving simultaneously. And I think that has stuck with me in how do you conceptualize and think about this issue. Either you do it through a straw, or you try to connect it on the macro, meso, micro level with lots of different actors that Martha was sort of outlining. But I also find myself in a panel with experts that are far younger, more attractive, but also more knowledgeable about the minute micro details about some of these sort of issues. I look forward also listening to many of that. I also want to say that, since I introduced the chess analogy, that I think the future challenge of global jihadism is perhaps rather more like the game Go rather than chess. And as you know, in the game of Go, it's ever expanding, multiple fronts with no clear frontiers and no standard definition of success or victory. We are now facing today, with the Islamic State, an unprecedented security challenge, and the appeal is massive. Maybe what I can contribute to the conversation is perhaps to give you an idea of how massive that is in the Western world. I come from Scandinavia, I come from Sweden. In my country, over 300, I say over 300, citizens have traveled to join Daesh. Some have joined Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups. But this picture is, of course, the same. And when you look at the numbers, they belie the amount of people that are actually going. The return rate is about 30% from many of the states within the European Union. Most of them maybe are not dangerous or the most committed foreign fighters. Yet since autumn of 2013, we have seen at least 27 terror plots planned in the EU, besides the attacks in Brussels against the Jewish Museum, in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo, and in Copenhagen, where I was caught up 3 blocks away from the attacks against the synagogue. And also, as the last case illustrates, you don't have to go to Syria. It's important to recognize that sympathizers can pose as much of a danger as foreign fighters who have gone and returned. And therefore, we must focus in on the role and influence of social media in countering the recruitment narrative of global jihadism. It is also, of course, the neighboring states to Syria and Iraq in the MENA region where there is another level of serious recruitment. And I worry a lot about the refugees that are in the neighboring countries falling prey to Daesh and to recruiters. We've seen that in other conflicts. Look at Al-Shabaab in Dahab and other camps. And in particular, it would be interesting to hear about Tunisia, because for me, they stand out as the spike in the chart, with over 4,000 Tunisians have become foreign fighters in Syria. I saw recently the Tunisian government was saying 12,000 they had stopped, but maybe I'm not sure if that's a correct number. But also they have another couple of thousand in Libya, in neighboring Libya, in Mali, and also in Yemen. I want to make 5 brief points, since I know that the chairman is looking at me eagerly, about the appeal of the Islamic State, and particularly in relation to what I see as are the overarching factors that may be interesting. The first point I want to connect to the foreign fighters from Europe going is that Daesh has created a highly effective narrative that is anti-hegemonic, populist, a resistance narrative using victimhood, which connects to the conditions and discourse of the discriminated youths in the West. It is connecting on all these different levels. And perhaps for those of you who watch this, you probably watch this much more than I do, but it became very clear that Daesh is clever about combining current events and conspiracy theories. For example, the Islamic State revealed its, or ISIS revealed its new currency in an hour-long video entitled "The Rise of the Khilafah and the Return of the Golden Dinar," where it said the creation of the currency will help to break the enslavement of capitalism underpinned by the US dollar. Now, good luck to them, but with Michael Moore-like qualities. I sat through London last week with people saying, who were from the Muslim community, saying, I am working against this, but I can feel that they are, 70% they're tapping into messaging that is really appealing to youth. They know youth audiences much better. And of course, as Boaz was saying, they were also talking about the claim that they have infiltrated 4,000 operatives among the refugee flow. Now, this is very deliberate in the fact that it's trying to sow the seeds of discord and division and Islamophobia, etc., within its recruitment strategy. Now, what I worry about in relation to my first point, and I'm not alone because I hear security services are also talking about this, is that Daesh ideological vision and appeal, or its vision, is becoming more normalized among youths in Western cities. The second point I want to make is that Daesh has multiple centers of gravity. Now, there are vilayats or provinces popping up everywhere. They're gaining strength day by day. Libya is an area which, when I talk to Egyptians, are very worried about, because it is that where you have that perfect storm with refugees and also with the future, but also in relation to the stability of Tunisia. The Khorasan, they are actually blowing up Taliban. They are executing them, beheading them. They're more extreme. And some of it, of course, is clever psychological propaganda. Some of it is very real. And it exploits these sectarian tensions that exist, and they have become rather good at that in both the propaganda but also in the real term. The third point I want to make is that Daesh is competing with Al-Qaeda for the leadership. And of course, many would say that he has won that sort of battle. And the Islamic State has, of course, persuaded many of the groups that were previously in Al-Qaeda's orbit to break away or to restyle themselves into these provinces. Which brings me to the fourth point, and that is something that Dawood Gartenstein-Ross recently wrote an article and highlights the issue, and that is that perhaps Al-Qaeda is pursuing a rebranding strategy, and that campaign has been invigorated. In other words, that Al-Qaeda looks more reasonable and controllable compared to the Islamic State. And I think you make a very good case that we should perhaps look at that they are learning, adapting, molding, but also doing what Hamas is doing, trying to provide a social service network, competing for funding from different sponsors, and waiting and seeing. So I would say that one would not count them out. And Al-Qaeda, of course, is maybe downplaying the threat the group poses, both internally but also to the West. My last point, and you'll be happy that it's almost my last point, is that Daesh also it takes responsibility for many of these sort of lone attacks that are happening. And in the recent piece that Thomas Hegghammer was writing together with Peter Nesser, they really illustrated that the majority of the attacks we're seeing with ISIS hallmark, it is really independent attacks. Now, I don't think we have really seen the ISIS full capability to wage terror in the streets of European capitals. And I don't think it is in their interest to do so, because that would refocus, that would also turn their attention away. But they may they're trying to consolidate, of course, what they have, but also expand, both in the propaganda sphere, but also physically. So in conclusion, I think that you may think that Al-Qaeda is on the verge of collapse as an organizational structure, and the decision-making has sort of ceased to function. And there is, I think, some evidence to suggest that. And I also equally think Daesh will endure for a long time. It's interesting to look at people like Makdisi, etc., how they are reacting on this sort of issue. And it may be naive to think that Daesh and Al-Qaeda will reunite. I think this is what he said. They will reunite in the future. And for now, he says ISIS is drunk on power. It seems to be that these older ideologues, the time has really overtaken them, and that Al-Qaeda it came at the wrong moment, in a sense, in terms of technological evolution and being able to brand itself. I think there's a realization in Al-Qaeda it needs to change to adapt to these sort of circumstances. Makdisi says that kind of enabling jihad will establish our Islamic State. It will enable it to become a place of refuge for the weak. Now, the jury is still out whether there is patience for those kind of ideas among young militants and even attractive new recruits. As one famously said very recently in an interview, he said, young jihadists want action, they want blood, they want explosions. They're sitting in their countries and either they will be in jail or something like this, and they're waiting for Al-Qaeda to do something, and Al-Qaeda is doing nothing. So I think that there are some interesting signs that Al-Qaeda is changing. Whether they will materialize or not in terms of being able to transform is entirely another question. It's also interesting, we shouldn't forget the evolution in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in the refocusing of Al-Qaeda in relation to those sort of theaters. So, in essence, I think it's a depressing thing for me to say as a Swede, since we are always optimistic. We'll have to play both three-dimensional chess and go for the foreseeable future. So I would concur with Fernandez, who eloquently pressed on the issue of that the ISIS is a state of mind, and it will continue perpetually. And it will also, and I worry about this equally, lead to polarization and an increase in right-wing extremism as a result. And it's a major task not only to go after the ISIS and the other jihad, the global jihadist front bearers, but it's equally a challenge to hold together our societies when they are confronting this. So, thank you.
So it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be on a panel that's commemorating Dr. Paz, who's truly one of the giants in the field. What I'm going to talk about in my remarks is something that Magnus alluded to, which is the way Al-Qaeda is positioning themselves with the rise of the Islamic State, which right now is consuming so much of our attention and so much attention of states within the Middle East and North Africa. What ISIS has been able to do is open up multiple new markets for jihadism that didn't exist 5 years ago. In particular, its mastery of social media and its understanding of how to mobilize people using that medium has helped to create a massive growth market for jihadism. That growth market, I would argue, would exist otherwise. There's too many factors that are propelling the various changes that are so helpful to this movement. The wave of instability that the Arab Spring touched off, the ungoverned spaces that exist in these regions, the opportunity for jihadist groups to exploit those ungoverned spaces, all of this means that the growth market for jihadism was overdetermined. But the fact that now this movement's able to reach into the West so easily, with 300 Swedes and Brits and Frenchmen and Belgians and people from all the countries of Europe and North America going over to this theater, it's created a very new dynamic. Now, it's had an impact on a wide variety of violent non-state actors. Magnus mentioned right-wing extremism, and that will certainly be a movement that's influenced in multiple ways, both by the fears of jihadist infiltration and also by their attention to the way that ISIS has been able to mobilize people. That mobilization through social media and other technological platforms will be very much replicated by a large number of other groups. But when we look at the competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the difference between the two organizations, I think, could be understood by looking at theories of revolutionary warfare. At the end of the day, both of these groups have similar goals. Both of them want to overthrow existing regimes and set up new states that are ruled according to their harsh version of Sharia law. Al-Qaeda adheres to a very familiar brand of revolutionary warfare, although they got off track, in large part due to ISIS's predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda is Maoist in orientation when you look at their style of revolutionary warfare. Maoism privileges politics over warfare. It holds that before you undertake warfare, you first have to have the, is this better? You first have to have the right political organization. That is, the very first stage in Maoist doctrine is a stage of organization, consolidation, and preservation. This is creating the political preconditions for undertaking warfare. In contrast to Maoism, you have another style called Foucaultism. Foucaultism was practiced successfully in the 1950s under Che Guevara, and what it holds is that violence itself can craft the political foundation necessary for revolution. Now, this was attempted many times thereafter, but never successfully. The one successful example we have of a Foucaultist organization seizing power is Cuba in the 1950s. Now, one thing we can query is whether social media changes this dynamics. As I said, one of the big aspects of ISIS's genius is understanding social media as a platform for mobilization. It's highly significant and something that allows for unprecedented scale of mobilization, which we can already see in Iraq and Syria and won't be seeing there for the last time. Now, the Iraq War was a formative experience for both organizations. In the Iraq War in the 2004 to 2007 period, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and the predecessor to ISIS, became a dominant insurgent organization on the ground. Al-Qaeda's senior leadership, based in South Asia, in Pakistan, was very critical of what Al-Qaeda in Iraq was doing. Their feeling at the time was that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was overplaying its hands, both through its brutality, something which we see as a characteristic that ISIS has maintained, and also in the way that it would impose a version of Sharia law uncompromisingly that was in contravention to local customs. This is not, of course, because Al-Qaeda is against implementing Sharia law. That is, after all, one of their goals. But compared to ISIS and compared to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they took on a much more gradualist view as to how to do this. Their view was that you shouldn't alienate the local population, and indeed that public support is necessary for the success of the group's overall mission. Now, the Iraq War was formative because you had this conflict between Al-Qaeda's senior leadership and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a conflict that remains to this day. Al-Qaeda in Iraq ultimately, while it became one of the dominant jihadist forces in the world, it ended up flaming out. And with it, it took a lot of Al-Qaeda's reputation with it. Al-Qaeda's senior leadership underwent a significant period of soul-searching, in which they looked to how you could replicate the kind of principles that were used against it. What Al-Qaeda in Iraq experienced was both the US's surge in troops, its shift to population-centric counterinsurgency, something that was designed to win over the Iraqi population, and also they faced a popular movement of Sunni tribes against them, something known as the Sahwa, or the Awakening. After the Iraq experience and the defeat of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, what Al-Qaeda's senior leadership looked to do was find ways that they themselves could win over the population and become a much more organic part of the populations in theaters that it wanted to operate in throughout the world. Now, you've had three events that have massively shifted the trajectory of Al-Qaeda. One is the Arab Spring, which created chaos and also offered new opportunities. In particular, in theaters like Tunisia and elsewhere, Al-Qaeda front organizations were for a while able to implement dawah or evangelism on the ground and win over new adherents, something that can be analogized to that first phase, the political phase in Maoist-style revolutionary warfare. A second thing is the Sunni-Shia conflict that's gripping the region has had a massive effect on how Al-Qaeda is perceived when coupled with the third factor, which is ISIS's rise. Put simply, ISIS's overt brutality has very much shifted our view of what's wrong for a jihadist organization or for a militant organization to do. Professor Crenshaw is right. The Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, they have not engaged in outbidding. I would argue that rather than trying to outbid ISIS, they instead have pivoted and are pivoting towards an entirely new audience. That pivot is to get them back to the way they wanted to be perceived prior to AQI's excesses during the Iraq War. If you look through the letters that were taken from the Abbottabad compound in Pakistan, where bin Laden was, ideologues spoke multiple times, including bin Laden, including Atiyah, who's the commander of regions, spoke about the need to change the way the organization was seen. They very much wanted to shift its view, so much so that an Egyptian leader of Al-Qaeda spoke about perhaps even changing the organization's name to de-emphasize military aspects. At this point, ISIS serves as a danger to Al-Qaeda. As several speakers have mentioned, it has siphoned off some Al-Qaeda affiliates to young people who want action. ISIS is the place to go. But the flip side is that Al-Qaeda can use ISIS as a convenient foil. That's exactly what they're doing. So if you look at who Al-Qaeda appeals to, it's also in the process of opening up new markets. Opening markets for people who, for example, who agree with the idea of Islamic State, who agree with the idea of the use of force, but who don't like the overt brutality of a group like ISIS. They are an alternative, one that's seen as more rational, and also to Sunni states in the region as more controllable. All you need to do is look at the geopolitical situation and look at what we would have thought of it back in 2011. So let's say in 2011, at the onset of the Arab Spring, you heard that in Syria, Al-Qaeda was holding territory, and Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia were supporting it. All that is happening via Jaish al-Fatah, a coalition of which the Nusra Front is a part. So you would think, okay, well, what is the US doing? What kind of sanctions are being placed on Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia? Well, what if you heard that those are the US's allies in the theater? Or Yemen, right? Al-Qaeda controls the port city of Mukalla. It controls parts of Aden. What is the US doing? Well, it's backing Saudi Arabia, who's undertaking an aerial campaign which is allowing Al-Qaeda to capture territory. Like, the rise of ISIS has massively complicated this picture, and this rebranding creates this dimension of complexity that we've only begun to get our heads wrapped around. I agree with Professor Crenshaw, I agree with Assaf that we should not count Al-Qaeda out. And I would say that if we ignore this repositioning, if we assume that the Islamic State makes Al-Qaeda a non-issue, then this problem, this 3D chess game which is underwater with pieces moving, will become infinitely more complex. Maybe, I don't know how to add to that metaphor, maybe it's in outer space, so the waters, but at any rate, this has become an extraordinarily complex problem based upon the way ISIS has moved the window for what we see as acceptable and unacceptable for militant organizations. It's caused this realignment where Al-Qaeda is a part of the strategic picture for allies of the United States and other Western states. And the sooner we understand this dynamic, the sooner we can actually respond, because you can't play 3D chess underwater effectively if you don't understand that that's the game that's being played.
It's a pleasure to be speaking today at this conference. I actually never knew Dr. Reuben Paz personally. I came to the IDC almost a year ago, and I came in the name of as a Rubin Research Fellow, in the name of blessed memory of Barry Rubin. So today I'm going to, as I've explained, one of my main focuses is on Islamic State bureaucracy. So the particular angle I'm going to take with regards to this debate about whether Islamic State is the future of global jihad is to explore this model of the Islamic State as an actual state and how the model of administration has developed at the home front. So by that I mean Iraq and Syria, and abroad where it has so many affiliates and new wilayats or provinces have been declared. So the Islamic State as a state is a very key distinguishing aspect of its self-presentation, in contrast to Tanzim al-Qaeda, the organization of the base, or Jabhat al-Nusra, or Jamaat Jabhat al-Nusra, the group of Jabhat al-Nusra support front for the people of the Levant, and so on and so forth. And the model prototype on the home front has, as I mentioned, been on the home front, that is Iraq and Syria. So what I would propose to do is to analyze that model of administration that's emerged on the home front. Is it viable, and to explore the various nuances of it? And secondly, can the Islamic State affiliates abroad replicate that model? And if the answer is yes or no, what exactly does it mean? And also, one has to explore the connection between home and abroad. Like, if we deem the Islamic State's model at home to be viable, does the very fact that it survives increase its chances for being the future of global jihad? Home front Iraq and Syria is the most developed stage yet, controlling contiguous territory, major towns like Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa city in Syria. And since the announcement of the caliphate on the 29th of June 2014, you see a central government, ostensibly a central government, embodied in various diwans, or it's called government departments or whatever, and then the division of the territory into various provinces and or wilayas, and then each province will have an office for the wali or the governor of that province, or we call it the diwan al-wilaya. There's also a higher body called the General Supervisory Committee that can issue orders from above to various diwans and wilayats. So best example of this is December 2014. The General Supervisory Committee ordered a ban on Apple devices because they have built-in GPS and they didn't want their movements being tracked by the coalition. You also have other bodies. I mean, what I would stress is that the methodology I use is to take documents that haven't been released in the Islamic State's propaganda, because those can tell you a lot more, I think, about the inner workings of the organization than just going by their photo releases that come day after day in videos, etc. And the thing is, you know, one finds names of new bodies, they turn up regularly. So one that I discovered more recently was something called the Hijra Committee that provides financial assistance in bringing over Muhajirin. If you want to join the Islamic State, you live abroad, but you don't have the money, if you know someone in the Islamic State, then this person in the Islamic State can fill out a form for you, so the Islamic State will pay for all the expenses you need to come. So these are the names of various diwans that can be identified, and I've given a table with giving the function of each of them. So this is on the home front, just to stress again. So for example, the khidmat deals with public services, electricity, water, sewage and road maintenance. Ta'aleem deals with education. The Diwan al-Jund deals with military and training camps. The Hisba deals with Islamic morality, Islamic police, enforcement of good business practices. So for example, if you are selling gone-off meat in your restaurant, the chances are the Hisba will come and reprimand you for it and might close your store temporarily. The Qada wal-Madhalim deals with real estate. So as an example, so if you flee Islamic State territory and then don't come back and you're given an ultimatum, then the Qada issues the directive to have your property confiscated and become Islamic State real estate. The Ash'ari deals with outreach to the tribes. This is an important dynamic, although not much documentary evidence. I've not been able to find much documentary evidence on it. Al-Aqat Amers, public relations, and I'm not going to go through all the names. Rikaz, though, is noteworthy because it has multiple divisions. One that deals with oil and gas, the other with licensing of to excavate for antiquities, and which could then be sold on or whatever. The key thing is that Islamic State is not against ruins per se. It's idolatrous ruins they have a problem with. Like anything with a graven image on it is likely to be destroyed. But a lot of antiquities are not like that. So analyzing this home front model, there are a lot of nuances that come up. There's a good degree of parasitism and co-optation. Best example of the services department. In Iraq, this has become particularly apparent, where they issue a notification to the already existing service officers to say, you've got to come to work under the Diwan al-Khidmat, otherwise your property will be taken. More recent thing I explored on a post I did for Aaron Zelin's site, Jihadology, was the very serious issues facing the Islamic State's health department. Brain drain, shortages of supplies and equipment, which are shown, for example, by price controls attempted to be issued by the Diwan al-Siha, and then multiple ultimatums for doctors and medical staff to come home or to come back to Islamic State territory, or we'll take you home. Not the same degree of comprehensiveness in administration everywhere. To give two examples, Mosul, I think, in Iraq is where you see the most elaborate structure of Islamic State administration. But Tikrit, which the Islamic State controlled from the summer of last year till the end of March of this year, really there was no real evidence of any Islamic State administration going on there at all, because Tikrit, the town itself, had become a ghost town. Some fled because of government bombing, but a lot of people in Tikrit were opposed to the Islamic State and simply fled fearing the prospect of their rule. Also, one has to relate administration to military strategy on the home front. So, for example, in Beji, where this constant fighting goes on between the Islamic State and Iraqi government forces, I don't think the Islamic State could care less whether Beji town or the refinery gets destroyed, because it's a good way to pin down the Islamic State, to pin down the government forces, and you saw that in the taking of Ramadi. Internal documents show a mobilization was declared in the Syrian provinces to reinforce the fighting fronts in Anbar and Salah ad-Din, and the Beji fighting was clearly a distraction as gearing up to take Ramadi. On a more general level, there's a sense of stability and order that comes with this administration, and it has a very tight security apparatus capable of putting down internal rebellion. And they certainly have created, I think, based on my own experiences of talking to people in Islamic State territory a sense of fear. And to request documents from people, it takes time. There's a lot of fear, for example, that the internet is being monitored. And the Islamic State has put out regulations under its Diwan al-Aman, or security department, regulating internet, restricting Wi-Fi, trying to limit it only to within internet cafes. So I feel that it seems unlikely the Islamic State is going to be dismantled from within. And their slogan, Baqir, I think certainly applies, even if it's not tetamedded or expanding in various places. So there's no fatal challenges to its rule in the key strongholds. So the question then is, does the very fact that it remains on the home front, at least ostensibly as a conventional state with government departments, whatever the nuances we explore, does this ensure the viability of its brand abroad? But then looking abroad, what you see is there have been so many Islamic State wilayats or provinces been declared. It's superficially quite impressive, but there are very few affiliates at present that have been able to replicate the model of administration that developed on the home front abroad. The best example, as has been mentioned before, is Libya. And the two cities in this case are Sirte and Derna. Derna, very early on, involved the allegiance of a group called Majlis Shura Shabab al-Islam. And around October of 2014, you began seeing in Derna these various Islamic State bodies set up on the model of Iraq in Syria. So Islamic Court, Diwan al-Ta'lim, an education department, and so on. But however, that created, I think, an impression in the media, and David has touched on this topic before, about how there was this widespread impression that the Islamic State controlled all of Derna. Actually, the Majlis, there were other factions still present in Derna, the Majlis Shura Mujahideen for Derna, and they were very quickly dismantled this structure in June. They simply got fed up of Islamic State rule and kicked them out. And they haven't been able to go back there since. Now, Sirte, which is Gaddafi's hometown, is a bit of a different case. There, they've been able to set up a structure, and not only that, they've also been able to put down an internal rebellion. So Sirte, I think, bears more prospect. And so when people are talking about Sirte as like a third capital, what they mean is that it seems to be, it will replicate, I think, Raqqa and Mosul, which can be seen as de facto capitals of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, respectively. Sinai hints of governance, but mostly it's a military threat, and I don't think the Sisi regime's policies aiming to crack down on this insurgency have helped. There is certainly a potential, I think, to seize major towns. I fear it's a bit like Iraq 2013, where you constantly had these new initiatives announced, meant to crack down on the rise of ISIS, but they really just didn't achieve anything, like Maliki's Revenge of the Martyrs. But then moving to other affiliates, representing terrorist threats, exploiting splinters in jihadi movements like the Caucasus Emirate, which has given rise to this Wilayat al-Caucas, and AQIM, Wilayat al-Jazair in Algeria. But no real hint of any state-like governance. And one can posit that if they're unable to develop state-like governance in the future, it may put the viability of the Islamic State brand abroad into doubt. I mean, one has to be clear that the Islamic State, as it's developed in Iraq and Syria, this is through years of work, and it's much more organic than abroad. Yemen, as David has also touched on before, there you're seeing AQAP governance and control of territory. It's much more advanced than the Islamic State. Muqalla, parts of Aden, and so on. The Islamic State did put out a media release from its so-called Wilayat al-Aden showing a health clinic, but you really have to treat that, again, with the same skepticism you should treat the Diwan al-Sihab, the Islamic State, within the home front. IS is better known in Yemen for mass bomb attacks targeting the Houthis. There's a nasheed, or song, the Islamic State put out called The Son of Yemen, which the chorus includes the lyric of blow up the Houthi in Sana'a, also saying the America is behind you and the Mejusi or the Zoroastrian is in front of you. AQAP, however, seems to be the group that fills the vacuum left by coalition advance against the Houthis. Last one I touched on is Khorasan, in terms of notable affiliates abroad. Some rumors have come up, and I get to stress this is very, nothing really corroborates at this moment. It's very speculative at the moment, of attempts to exploit mines in Afghanistan, apparently similar to what the Taliban did to generate revenue. One could see that as like proto-Diwan al-Rakaz activity, because, say, the Diwan al-Rakaz of IS literally means precious resources, and mining would no doubt come under that. So the conclusion is, I think, like the war against the Islamic State on its home front, there's ebb and flow and factors that could go either way in whether it could claim the mantle of being the future of global jihad. I think it will remain, in any case, as a brand and some kind of force, at least I think indefinitely. And I think in terms of the home front, at least, I think short of a major ground intervention, that state like that structure that's emerged unlikely to be dismantled. Scenarios that could upset the ebb and flow, the death of Baghdadi, leader of the Islamic State. I'm not convinced they have a viable successor to him. One of the things you discover in Islamic State bureaucracy and looking at the documents is there's so many figures that turn up who are otherwise completely anonymous. And that's one of the geniuses one of the benefits, I think, is that when you have just anonymous figures, they could be seen as easily replaceable. For example, the IS Islamic State Emir of Mosul, as we've discovered in document analysis, is a guy called Abu Qatada al-Iraqi, but I otherwise have no idea who he is. Vice versa via Al-Qaeda, what would happen if Aymenn al-Zawahiri got killed, for example? So I would not want to judge either way yet if the Islamic State is future of global jihad. What I want to do is give you a specific angle to explore various possibilities. Thank you.
It's a true honor to be on a panel in the memory of Reuben Paz. Unfortunately, I never got to meet him, but we did talk to each other over email a number of times, and I would say that in many ways he's the Abdullah Azzam of the jihadi studies movement. We would not be here without him in many respects. And as Magnus noted, his PRISM website's very valuable if you're interested in analysis and primary source documentation going back to the late 90s and early 2000s. What I wanted to talk about today was a little bit about the Islamic State's methodology, broadly speaking, not just in particular related to the administration and governance, though. That is definitely an aspect of it. I think this is important because in some ways the Islamic State is more predictive in terms of what it might try and do in other areas, whether it's in new areas of control in Syria and Iraq, or whether they're trying to attempt to bolster themselves in areas outside of this central zone. I sort of split this up into two types of controls. The first is the pre-territorial control phase, and the second one is complete takeover of territory. And in each phase, I'd argue there are 5 sort of points. The first one is the intelligence phase, then there's the military, then there's the dawah, then there's the hizbah, and then there's the governance phase. And in the takeover, there's another set of these as well. So I just wanted to go through each one, and I think it will better help us understand analytically where each sort of branch or wilaya, or however you want to describe it, is at this current point, whether it's inside of Syria, Iraq, or even outside, because while you see those maps on newspapers online of these big black blobs, the reality is that the Islamic State doesn't have full control over most areas shown in these maps. So I think it's important to highlight this. So in the pre-territorial control phase, first, I'd argue that there's this intelligence phase where essentially the Islamic State tries to insert itself in a territory on a sleeper cell level, where they're trying to either quietly buy off individuals, co-opting local clans, as well as local groups. A good example of this is Liwa Shuhada al-Yarmouk in southern Damascus region. And then, in addition to that, they're also learning terrain about who are the key actors, who are the notables, who are the people that they foresee as being enemies in the future. Therefore, this provides a potential roadmap for what they need to do once they get into the different phase in this. Then I'd argue there's the military phase. This is where you see a lot of their asymmetric warfare, whether it's a hit and run type of attacks, assassinations, IEDs, car bombs, suicide bombers, the typical type of things you might hear about in a news story about the organization. Then there's the Dawah phase. This is when they're a lot more public about what they're trying to attempt in this particular territory that they're operating. So this is when they're reaching out to locals, they're providing Dawah forums to individuals to try and learn about who the Islamic State is. A lot of these are focused on children in many respects, since they understand that the future is with the youth. So they don't really care about anybody the age over the age of 35. Another aspect of this is that you'll see them in the streets, in markets, as well as at checkpoints, passing out Dawah literature. And then you also see them reaching out to the local notables and tribes. Then you might start to see more of the judicial or social policing type of activities. This is the Hizbah. So you see them burning cigarettes, hookahs, their so-called sorcery stuff, since there's a lot of wizards apparently in the territories that they control. You also see them destroying Shia and Sufi shrines, as well as some of the ancient artifacts that we've seen in Palmyra, unfortunately. There's also checking whether people are praying during the specific times of prayers. And as Aymenn noted, they're also looking at the different markets and shops to see whether there's food or medicine that is spoiled or expired, to make sure that people are getting the proper types of help there. And then the last phase in terms of the pre-territorial control is sort of this proto-governance that we would like to see here. And this it's not too advanced. You see some taxation, you see judicial penalties, and some types of reconciliation that they might do between individuals or clans. And then you see basic social services, whether it's with food being passed out, whether it's some medicine here and there, but it's not really that advanced. Then you go on to the full territorial control phase. And we really only see this in places in Syria and Iraq, but now also in the city of Sirte in Libya. But beyond that, you don't see anything like this. So even though you do hear about all these pledges of bay'ah, or these creation of all these different provinces outside of Syria and Iraq, I'd argue that so far the only really mature location of this has been in Sirte, Libya, which is in the Gulf of Sidra. Whereas in the other areas, they're all in this sort of pre-territorial control phase. So when you look at the intelligence phase after they take control, you see more of this Stasi-style outfit, where it's looking for enemies as well as doing these honeypots and entrapment type of cases, and that's where you'll start to see, we've seen the cases of these pictures of individuals that are gay being thrown off of roofs, and this is where it comes into play and things like that. Then in the military phase, we really have only seen this in Iraq and Syria, where it's more of they're fighting more in a state-to-state type of capacity, whether it's open warfare, whether they're using tanks and APCs. You see these large-scale caravans and mobilizations, these large-scale stormings. We really only have seen that type of activity in certain parts of Syria and Iraq. Then you have the Dawah phase in this particular area. This becomes a bit more advanced, where you start seeing them putting up billboards in different areas of the territory they control, and it has different messaging, whether it's related to religion, whether it's related to jihad, whether it's related to women's morality. And this is important because it tries to create their messaging as second nature to the local population. And we only do see this in Syria, Iraq, and Sirte, Libya. In addition, you see the setting up of these so-called media points, where they have these kiosks in different areas of villages and cities, where they'll provide literature, CDs, USB drives, SIM cards to individuals to try and pass out, in particular to children and youth. Another aspect of this is they also show off people on the front lines doing ribat, essentially people at the outer edges of their territory, and they're sort of re-emphasizing the importance of the messaging, so that people do not sort of fall back and try and leave the Islamic State. So they do continue to provide even more Dawah literature in this case as well. And then the last aspect of Dawah when they're controlling territory is these communal watching of their videos. You hear so much about their social media and how they're, radicalizing people on the internet. But the reality is that this kind of material is happening on the local level as well. So we shouldn't forget about those who are being exposed to this in Syria and Iraq as well. The phase of Hizbah is, of course, areas that we've seen, many people have seen online, whether it's their hands getting cut off, whether it's people getting whipped, stoned, thrown off buildings, crucified, or summarily executed. We see this more when they're in areas that they're fully in control of. And then the last part is the governance aspect in phase 2, or when they're controlling territory, which is the most sophisticated part of their apparatus, which we really only see in, say, maybe Wilayat Raqqa, parts of Wilayat Deir ez-Zor, or I should say Al-Khair, as they say, as well as Wilayat Dijla, Al Jazeera, and Nineveh. Those are the western parts of Iraq, as well as, to a lesser extent, in Libya, but it's still being built up. But essentially, you see them putting flags on everything. So if you're in the United States, for example, and you're in Pennsylvania Avenue, there's an American flag on every single flag post. If you go down to downtown Jerusalem, there's Israeli flags everywhere. In the same way, they're trying to highlight that they're here to stay, and there's black flags literally put up on every flag post in different parts of towns and cities that they control. Additionally, you see different road signs where they're creating new entrances to towns or villages, as well as new signs of cities that they're in charge of. In many cases, they've actually changed the names of villages and towns that they're in control of to highlight that they are the rulers now. And then there's the public works projects. Of course, this isn't, say, something like the New Deal or something you might see in Scandinavia or Switzerland, but you do see them building roads or having roads that were previously gravel turned into blacktop, fixing electrical lines. They're fixing and cleaning the roads. They're doing the landscaping. They're also building new mosques and shops, not just markets, but brick and mortar type of shops. And then they're also trying to attempt to restart industries in areas they control. Part of this is just trying to co-opt aspects of daily life that were already happening previous to them being in control. And Aymenn's talked about this numerous times, that they're not really necessarily restarting restarting new apparatuses, but they're just continuing what was happening before. Of course, they're not necessarily doing that well, as Aymenn noted in relation to the health administration, but they are trying to restart the water facilities, the seasonal harvests, doing the breaking of stones in stone quarries, the production of marble, wood, blacksmiths, brick, as well as the growing of vegetables and fruits. This is a highly sophisticated apparatus, even if it isn't that advanced in comparison to other countries and states, but it highlights that they are attempting to really build this state. And I think by understanding these different phases within the pre-territorial control and then actually taking control can help us provide signposts or milestones of where the organization or state is in the territories that it controls. And it's helpful because in many cases, you hear debates about them in Iraq/Syria versus outside of those areas. But I think this is relevant also in those territories as well, because I think even though their home bases in Iraq and Syria, we sometimes forget that they don't have necessarily full control over all these areas. In many ways, they go back and forth. So hopefully this provides maybe a model or at least an analytical tool for better understanding where the Islamic State is in terms of their governance, but also in terms of exportation and whether this model is applicable in other areas outside of their central base. So thank you very much.
Hello.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for the really thought-provoking remarks, and I think we've seen really like a very, very broad gamut of lectures here, from the very broad picture all the way to very minute details. And one of the things I was thinking of as I heard these really illuminating presentations is that, we're here at a conference, sponsored by the ICT, the Institute for Counter-Terrorism, but so much of what you actually talked about actually has to do with a lot more than terrorism, right? So ISIS, I mean, by most conventional definitions of terrorist groups that we can find in the textbooks in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, right? Terrorist organizations are defined as small organizations, like very, very small in size, organizations that can barely seize land, right? Hold land, who act secretly, right? But now we hear about this organization, or whatever it is, right, that has a bureaucracy, which is very, very similar to like a political organization, right? Aaron, you described kind of these stages, which almost sound like a military strategy, like of expansion. David, you described Maoism, Foucaultism. By the way, I think my insurgency students had a blast hearing this, so they must have been very happy. I hope you paid attention. So you describe almost kind of like an insurgent. You made an insurgency analysis here. So my question then is, what are we actually talking about? What is the Islamic State? Is it a terrorist group? Is it something else? And does it matter?
This is a phenomenal question, and it absolutely matters. We often describe these groups as terrorist groups, and I think terrorism should be understood precisely the way Assaf outlines it. Terrorism is a tool of a weak organization that specifically uses primarily terrorist attacks, that is, attacks on civilians, in order to try to generally provoke an overreaction by the state against the organization and thus rally the community behind it. Both Al-Qaeda and also ISIS are far beyond the stage of terrorism, and I think they can't be described fully as insurgencies either. The framework I use personally is violent non-state actors. If you look at the broader picture, what's happening in the world is we had this moment, it was a long moment, but it was a historical moment in which the Westphalian state was so dominant that it was really thought of as the only legitimate form of political organization. If you think of the major violent non-state actors during the 20th century, they generally wanted to be admitted into the nation-state club. Think of the IRA, ETA, think of the PLO. They all wanted to be states. Now you have violent non-state actors emerging who have no desire to be states. They don't want to be admitted into that club. ISIS has made very clear that when they talk about being a state, it's a very different conception than what we have. They do not seek recognition by the United Nations. So the Westphalian state is receding. Violent non-state actors are rising. And let me make an analogy to finish this off. Because we can see another area where bigger is no longer better. Your nation states are bigger than violent non-state actors. But if you look at economic markets, they've changed massively over the course of the past 15 years as well, for reasons that are very similar to the reasons that the nation state is being technological in nature. Startups are now able to outcompete several times over what we call legacy industry. These big industries that are often very bureaucratic, they have a hard time maneuvering. And the competition between violent non-state actors and nation states looks a lot like the competition between startups and legacy. Violent non-state actors are like startups. They enjoy the same advantages. They're able to leverage technology, they're small and adaptable, they're able to quickly settle on a strategy and change that strategy. And often their competitors are much more bureaucratic. Now, that's much more the case for the United States than for Israel. I mean, one thing about Israel is it's a small country, and thus, on stage yesterday, for example, are talking about Israeli strategy. That's the kind of thing you could see being implemented. The US and other large countries have a hard time undertaking strategy. Legacy industries have had to adapt in order to compete with startups. And one thing we're going to have to grapple with in very large Western states, we can compete with violent non-state actor competitors, because right now, if you look at, for example, the situation in Syria and the greater Middle East, the United States is having a hard time formulating even the basic kind of strategy, and it's much to our detriment.
I think any of the other speakers want to comment on that?
I think he answers.
And I also had a question. This maybe relates mostly to Aaron. So you kind of laid out this the strategy of taking hold, and I'm wondering, and certainly I think other panelists can weigh in. Is there a similar, like, is there an expansion strategy in terms of how ISIS picks affiliates? So my question really relates to, so we talked a lot about kind of how it physically expands, right? Tata Madad, pardon my horrible pronunciation, right, in Syria and Iraq. What about its strategy of affiliations? Is there any logic to it? Is there a system to it?
Yeah, I'd argue that there's two logics to it. The first one is whether they think that they can actually take control of a territory there, and then, start this model of governance that I talked a little bit about, as well as Aymenn. And then the second one is areas where Al-Qaeda might be strong, where they try and piece away aspects of Al-Qaeda's branches, because those are the two main areas where I think that are relevant to them. Because if they're able to export this model outside of Iraq and Syria, it shows that it's potentially viable. But then if they're also able to defeat and destroy Al-Qaeda, or at least break to the point where they're not viable anymore, then they sort of win the global jihad in many respects. Thus far, they've had a difficult time, I'd argue, in both spots so far. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to continue to try. But I'd say that those are the two main elements.
Yes, I would concur with Aaron in the broad assessment, and just to give some examples to supplement it. So you take, relevant to this context of Israel is the talk of IS in Gaza. Now the question of Islamic State in Gaza, what you actually have there is groups who are pro-Islamic State, but they're not united and they're very localized. So for example, there are multiple groups in Gaza called Ansar al-Sharia, pro-Islamic State or not. You also have some of these other groups that we've looked at, like Jamaat Ansar al-Dawlat al-Islamiyya fi Bayt al-Maqdis, Ansar al-Dawlat al-Islamiyya fi Gaza. Also, Sarai Sheikh Omar al-Hadid is the latest one. But these are all small groups, and it's clear the Islamic State doesn't accept them as affiliates because they are small and disunited and can't come together to form a Wilayat al-Gaza. Another example, relating to Aaron's question, positing of whether it can take territory or not, was a group in India called Tanzim Ansar al-Tawheed fi Bilad al-Hind, means the Ansar al-Tawheed organization in India. This pledged allegiance to the Islamic State in October of 2014. Previously, they tried to play both sides of being pro-Al-Qaeda and pro-ISIS before the caliphate was announced. But it's clear that this is such a small group in such a vast area. The Islamic State doesn't see any point in accepting it as affiliate. So to this day, it just primarily continues. Its primary function is just to translate media releases from the Islamic State into Gujarati and Hindi and Punjabi. Libya, in contrast, I think the Islamic State saw that as a good opening because of the chaotic environment there. I think also the same is true of Yemen, and then it combines the fact that to compete against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. One more thing I might add is symbolic. Like with the Saudi Arabia in declaring a Wilayat al-Bilad al-Haramain, I think that that seems natural, given that Bilad al-Haramain is the place of the two holiest sites in Islam. And since 2013, in particular, you saw a lot of these unofficial pro-Islamic State social media. You saw a lot of these cases of anonymous placards from Saudi Arabia declaring support for the Islamic State, or an Islamic State cake, or someone in the Kaaba, at the site of the Kaaba holding a placard in support of the Islamic State. So those are some of this is how it translates into the real world of examples, but I wholly agree with Aaron on that.
Well, you wanted to mention? I wanted to also ask you about right. The jihadi movement is oftentimes kind of portrayed as a very homogeneous movement, but we know, I mean, from the Al-Qaeda, right? From the Al-Qaeda example, very significant divisions, even when it comes to agreeing on who the main enemy is, right? Traditionally, for Al-Qaeda, there were the Crusaders, right, on the one hand, the Western Christian nations led by the United States, and then you had the Zionists. And you had, of course, the apostates, right? The local, the nominal, the near enemy, the nominal Muslims who don't follow the right path. Do we see similar divisions within the Islamic State as to which enemy should be supreme?
I don't really see that. At least one of the things about the Islamic State is the way its media operation is so centralized. So, for example, going to this General Supervisory Committee I mentioned in the presentation, one of the things they also do is they any media released by the Islamic State involving scenes of violence and slaughter approved by them before it can be released. Sometimes you also get one example I have put on Jihadology on our site was it's a joint statement between the Diwan al-Khilafa, which I think corresponds to the General Supervisory Committee. It's supposed to be like the central cabinet, and the media office Wilayat al-Nain were requesting a media release to celebrate advances in Iraq and Syria. So the discourse gets very regulated, and he's going by that in terms of who they say the enemy are. It seems fairly consistent that they're just against anyone who doesn't subscribe to their thinking. They don't seem far and near enemy debate. It's like they're all kafar, and at least that's the impression I get. Mm-hmm. But just before I move on, in terms of divisions, I mean, one thing you could say is like in terms of the membership composition of the Islamic State, it's encompassing a diverse group of people. Like if you take Iraq, for example, a lot of the fighters are Iraqi fighters are people who are member of prior groups of other insurgent groups that pledged allegiance. So the estimate I have is that 90% of Iraq became Islamic State. This led to de facto collapse of that group in Iraq, and its survival, its offshoot branch in Syria survived. So David also has talked about this to an extent about trying to exploit those kinds of, exploit the fact that the Islamic State's ranks are not monolithic necessarily.
Yes?
No, I just want to not comment on the internal ones. They know much more about that issue. But since I work on foreign fighters inside of European cities, what you see is tremendous conflict between different groups. Not so much perhaps within different Sunni groups or different ethnicities, but rather between Sunni and Shia, between Kurds who are trying to find Sunni Muslims to beat up, for example, during Kobane, or between also Christians and Muslims. So there's tremendous mosaic of conflicts that are being played out in these sort of different cities, which I think perhaps I said that if I was in the other panel, but it is it is by no means sort of it's a mosaic of different conflicts, which I think we have to recognize and work with as we are trying to reduce the appeal. And lastly, let me just say, because I forgot to say that, and that is that one thing that surprises me about this phenomena and its appeal, etc., is the level of sympathy that is being expressed on social media in Western cities, right? So it is by far superseding anything that I have seen. We are, of course, not fully buying into that, but that's also something we have to sort of to think about, because there's nothing, and I have to say, in terms of counter-narrative in relation to that, we are still trying to devise or craft some type of that. That's not to negate the great work that Fernandez did, but it is a huge uphill struggle. But we need to think about how we can exploit that in these different divisions as we find partners, but also as we devise different ways of reducing its appeal.
Yeah, Aaron?
I think that at least in Iraq and Syria, you see less of an issue here, in part because the bureaucratic or state entity has full control over everything. So if there is dissent, you'll either get put in jail or killed, most likely. The biggest area, though, I think, look towards the possibility of this is when they bring in full organizations from outside. So whether it's the pledge from Boko Haram or Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, so far we haven't really seen much translation of the Islamic State's model in northern Nigeria, even though their pledge of was accepted by the Islamic State, and they're putting out their official media content, but you don't really see the same nature of what they're doing in Syria and Iraq, and now even in parts of Libya there as well, in part because the organization had been operating previously for years ahead of time, and they had a certain modus operandi, so it's hard to potentially change that overnight. And in the same way, you might have a difference between, say, the Bedouins versus, you know, Egyptians from mainland in the Sinai, and what that might bring into play in terms of the dynamics of Wilayat Sinai, whereas those that were more created organically or in the grassroots or actually molded by the Islamic State, such as the returning Libyan fighters from Syria and Iraq to Darna and then going over to Sirte, or even those who broke away from, say, AQAP in Yemen, or the Taliban and TTP and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, those you might see more following the mold because it's more because they're creating something new, whereas when you're bringing something in that already had a legacy and operating, it might be more difficult. And we saw this with Al-Qaeda when, you know, they brought in Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, Zarqawi's organization, as well as the GSBC, which became AQIM. They always were a bit more different than, say, AQAP, which was actually created by Al-Qaeda Central and organically coming from it. So that's areas we should look out for, I think.
And I think you're going to have the last word.
All right. Two short notes then. The first one is because you mentioned near enemy versus far enemy. I think this is an area where we need to revisit that concept. It was certainly, you know, the scholarship that's been done on this, the bulk of it was pre-Arab Spring scholarship. And, you know, the assumption was, on the part of jihadists, that if you have a chance to topple the near enemies, that is the regimes of the Middle East, then the far enemy, the United States and European powers, would step in and stop them from being toppled. The Arabs that that's not true anymore. And so I think the entire idea of near enemy, far enemy, a lot of times within my field, analysts' conception of this stops in 2010. And I think the idea of near enemy to far enemy has evolved since then. It's not meaningless, but I think it means something different. And so could do a very good study looking at what this means now. Second thing is, I agree with Aymenn about how the Islamic State isn't divided on how they categorize their enemy. Everyone's an enemy. Right now in Iraq and Syria, they're involved literally on wars on 10 different fronts. So rather than thinking about based upon them defining enemies differently, to me, one of the most profitable areas for understanding how to undermine this organization is to take a look at the immense amount of stress that it's under. I mean, even with the incompetent foes that it's against in many of these fronts, that's an enormous amount of stress that's trying to govern territory. And, you know, thinking through what that can lead to, you know, in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, several years, is, I think, one of the most profitable ways to understand how to exploit the position that the Islamic State has put itself in.
Excellent. And you had the penultimate word, so Magnus, you have the ultimate.
Well, thank you. I just want to say, you know, something I learned with dealing with different organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, others, and that is the concept of time and strategy. And I see sometimes documents from ISIS 2020, etc. They may be propaganda, they may not mean anything. But I was reminded of an article, and we have Yassin Moshabash here, who did a story in Der Spiegel when he was with them. And he interviewed Fuad Hussein, who had met many of the different Zarqawi types. Maybe it was based in Jordan and in Iraq. And they had a 7-stage plan. And they actually, it's pretty chilling when you look at it, because they pinpoint the exact date of the Arab Spring, the fall, the toppling of the government. And they also predict by the same year the declaration of the Islamic State. Now, is that fluke? I think that, you know, the currents and thinking is also longer term, whereas I think maybe the Islamic State is in a hurry to consolidate and to survive and to maybe expand. But we shouldn't think that this is going to go away in the near term.
And I'm sure that many of you are thirsty for much more information on the global jihad, ISIS. We have, of course, 2 days of workshop in the tail end of the conference. So there's more where that came from, so please visit us there too. Please help me thank our wonderful panelists.